Hi, this is Corey Franklin with Remembering the Past, the show where we talk about people who died recently who've had a profound effect on our history, our society, or our culture. Tonight we're going to begin with LeRoy Neiman, who died recently at the age of 91, who was one of the most familiar artists of the last 50 years because of his subject matter, his lifestyle, and his hobnobbing with celebrities. Here are two bits from two documentaries, one from New York City television and one from public television, on the life of LeRoy Neiman.
Many artists who work in the world of sports art, but there's little doubt who the most prominent or successful is, and there's that mustache too, LeRoy Neiman. LeRoy Neiman essentially created the idea of sports art, of capturing the athlete and the game for posterity, a career that has taken him around the world, painting and drawing the famous events, the World Series, the Olympics, and heavyweight title fights.
The people that love my paintings, that respond to my paintings the most, they look at me, they're spectators, they're not viewers. They look at it for the experience and the re-experience for themselves.
It is an art career unlike any other. His work has been displayed in some of the great museums of the world.
It would certainly be an oversimplification to say that LeRoy Neiman was just a sports artist. He painted many other famous subjects, and here are some of them.
Music, Broadway, yachts, food, drink, gambling, women, animals, celebrities, native cultures, surfers, dancers, politicians, bands, artists, dictators, showgirls, and beyond.
Well, here's how LeRoy Neiman started out, and as you'll hear, his formative years were spent here in Chicago with Playboy magazine and hanging around Rush Street. I remember the tales of him when I was a little kid.
LeRoy Neiman grew up poor during the Depression in St. Paul. His father left when Neiman was young, so he was raised alone by his mother. He says you had to fight in his neighborhood, but Neiman found his niche making posters for storefronts and proms and football games.
It was great. It gave me a special role, and I wasn't envied in any way. I was just an artist. Nobody wanted to be an artist, and nobody particularly admired it.
Neiman served as a cook in the Army during World War II, landing 6 days after D-Day and getting caught in the Battle of the Bulge. But he still had an opportunity to pursue his craft during the war, drawing portraits of the officers and creating posters designed to combat a very specific problem.
Started doing these VD posters, and that was a big problem. And I do these big VD posters, lettering and all this, and they're bordering on pornography, these posters. They were fun, and the guys all loved them. They'd steal them and everything.
He began to paint personalities in the Army. That continued after the war in Chicago, when he'd frequent jazz clubs and would see the pain of racism experienced by some of the great black jazz musicians of the time.
And these guys were artists. They were really, that was their life, their whole life. And all the hardships, the things they put up with, the embarrassments and humiliations, these guys were angry all the time. I mean, they were just pissed off, that's all the time. And they were always happy at the same time. And they played their hearts out.
In the early 50s, Neiman was freelancing at a Chicago department store when he met a guy who would soon create a new magazine, Hugh Hefner. He hired Neiman for Playboy, helping his career, and seemingly giving him a calling card with women.
It's also nice to go up on Michigan Avenue in Chicago with a tape measure. And we'd see a nice, very attractive girl coming up the street. We'd stop her. I'd like to be Playmate of the Month. No authorization from Hef at all.
Playboy eventually sent Neiman on the road for a regular feature called Man and His Leisure. On the surface, it seemed like a dream job.
I would travel first class, always first class, stay in grand hotels, eat the best restaurants, limousines, all that stuff. And I got so spoiled. I got tired of it.
You got to hand it to LeRoy. That was a novel approach to get to measure attractive girls, that is, attractive girls' big chests, giving them a come-on that they could be in Playboy. What put LeRoy on the international map were two sporting events that occurred in New York City in the late 60s, early 70s, when New York City was actually the sports capital of the United States and the world. One was the New York Jets' upset victory in the Super Bowl, and the second was the first Ali-Frazier fight, which we discussed in detail on the show we did on Joe Frazier a couple of months back. In Super Bowl III, the Super Bowl that made Joe Namath famous, the Jets coach, Weeb Ewbank, actually let LeRoy Neiman sit on the Jets bench during the game.
Weeb Ewbank, the coach, never really took to the idea. He thought, LeRoy, you can sit on the end of the bench, you can hang out.
When the Jets won that Super Bowl, LeRoy Neiman got to be friends with Joe Namath. Since Muhammad Ali was fighting in New York then, he also got to be friends with Ali, and he actually developed a special friendship with Ali that carried through to Ali's fights.
Boxing is one of Neiman's favorite subjects. He was there throughout Muhammad Ali's career, even doing a book with Ali. Perhaps the best example of Neiman's status as a sports insider came before an Ali bout at the Garden in 1970, when the fighter kicked everyone out of his locker room except his trainer and Neiman. Neiman proceeded to draw Ali on the training table in the dark.
You do that just now? I said, yep. And LeRoy, you can draw better in the dark than you can in the light. Ali, he had to come through. He put it in such a way where he had to do what he bragged about. And there was something about that quality that he revved himself up. And then he'd perform, he'd do it.
Well, his paintings of Ali are iconic, but he also made the cover of Time magazine with his roots back in Chicago and a famous Chicago sports hero. And I can tell you, Chicago Stadium was never louder than when this guy got the puck behind his own goal, skated down the ice, and took a 100-mile-an-hour slap shot. Even when Michael Jordan was playing in Chicago, it wasn't this loud.
He's also painted, for example, the hockey player Bobby Hull for the cover of Time magazine.
Interesting enough, what did LeRoy Neiman think was his most memorable painting? And it harkens back to a 1961 birthday party at Madison Square Garden that had nothing to do with sports, or at least nothing to do with conventional sports.
I think my most salvageable painting hangs in Madison Square Garden of the Jack Kennedy's birthday party. And Marilyn Monroe she came in on an elephant. She was singing to him.
What do you remember about Marilyn Monroe that night?
Her body, not her voice. But she had a kind of a fishnet gown on, shimmering with sequins or something like that.
Yeah, that's definitely a memorable image. One other little trivia point on LeRoy Neiman most people don't know. He had a cameo role in several of the Rocky pictures. Now really, is that any way for a serious artist to live? Not surprising that the conventional art world didn't think that much of LeRoy Neiman, and here's his rejoinder to his conventional art critics.
They don't understand. They've never been there. They never lived that way. So they think there's something about it that I'm looking for a good time. But I work the entire time. I work very hard. And I work a lot. I produce. I'm very productive. And I'm very self-critical of my work. But I just think they're wrong. That's all. They don't know. So that's what I worry about. I can't educate them. I can't shape up for somebody else. I got to do what I do, the way I live.
Finally, LeRoy Neiman's thoughts on his craft.
When you do a painting, you got the temperature of the painting. Like my thing is, if I start out and it's a little somber, the painting stays somber. If I start the painting with a little kick, I keep going. It's fun and it's hard work. It's tiring, but I do that better than I can do anything else. It's taking care of me pretty good.
And how could we leave LeRoy Neiman without a brief mention of his mustache? Here he is talking about it.
I had to take it off in the Army. I had it before the Army, and I kept it. As soon as I got out of the Army, I grew it back. And that's it. It's a prop. It's a prop.
Personally, I think he grew it early on to pick up girls. Back in those days, it was sort of a chick magnet type thing. Anyway, that's LeRoy Neiman. Whatever you thought of his artwork, love it or hate it, he was definitely a memorable character.
That's just me. It's a result of my experience, what I've seen, what I've responded to. The thing you got to do is go where you're strong. You got to go through this process of self-criticism. The whole creative process is self-criticism. You got to make it better. You got to change it.
Well, speaking of changing it, we're going to move on now to Rodney King, who definitely changed it. Rodney King died recently at the age of 47, and Rodney King changed our perception of the Los Angeles Police Department. For years and years and years, we had this perception of the Los Angeles Police Department as this dragnet sort of robotic, follow-the-law type of people. What happened to Rodney King in 1991 showed us that the LA Police Department was much different than they were portrayed on television, And at the same time, it sort of ushered in the video era of today with amateur videos. Here's CNN talking about Rodney King.
Los Angeles Times columnist Pat Morrison. Pat, thanks for joining us. Basically, this was a Californian who was clocked by police as speeding. They tried to pull him over. It led to a car chase, topping speeds of over 100 miles an hour. When he was finally stopped, there was a brutal beating. A fight was then tape recorded by someone who was watching, and then led to a year-long tension in Los Angeles. I wonder if you can put this death and this man's life into perspective as far as history is concerned of race relations.
I spent a lot of time with Rodney King at the end of April, the anniversary of the riots, and here was a collision of an unlikely person with the course of history. Just kind of a happy-go-lucky, ne'er-do-well guy. He'd had his own problems with the law already, and the fact that there was a video camera recording this resonated with so many people in the black community who thought, this happens all the time, but finally the rest of the world gets to see it. And that was the resonance of the Rodney King case. And he was a big guy, but even he acknowledged that his shoulders maybe weren't big enough to bear the burden of that history.
He also had, while the riots were ongoing, and the deadliest riots, I think, in L.A. history, said the famous phrase, "Can't we all just get along?" And it was his attempt. In fact, it occurs to me he was crying at the time because these riots were so awful, so many people died in them, that he was this unlikely player in a much larger story.
He was, and he said that he told me his lawyers had written a script for him, but he says he wasn't going to read that. This was very spontaneous, and he said growing up he went to Jehovah's Witnesses Kingdom Hall around Latinos and Asian people, and they were working together, and that, he said, is where he got that "can we all just get along" speech.
And Pat, this life just never came together, as you sort of alluded to. This was a man who sort of was in and out of trouble after that, and I think on CNN it also did some work on the anniversary. He also talked about having a drug problem that he still had yet to beat.
He had a drug problem. I think he'd pretty much done a good job with that, but he drank. He enjoyed fishing and drinking and those happy-go-lucky pursuits that he was still doing in his 40s. And he talked often about being stopped by police officers who would see his name, or if he didn't have his driver's license, which was often the case, find out it was Rodney King, and they just think, oh boy, I pulled over Rodney King. So he did get a bit of a pass on some of those things.
And let's talk a little bit about the riots that were ensued. This was a year later, a year after the police officers were found not guilty of wrongdoing, and it sparked days of riots in L.A. And as far as I know, are they not the deadliest riots in L.A. history?
I believe they are. There was something more than 50 people killed. The exact number, I think, was never found, and it really exposed a lot of fissures in cultures, in ethnic divisions in the city, and showed for a lot of people who were unaware of it how angry people still were, and it changed forever the way the Los Angeles Police Department does business.
And Pat, if I could, as a final question, what is the legacy of Rodney King, do you think, to history, to race relations?
We talked about this, and one cop told him once, 100 years after the rest of us are dead and gone, people are going to know your name. His name is a symbol of somebody who is victimized by a corrupt system. And he never really thought of himself as that. When people compare him to, say, Rosa Parks, he was simply abashed by it. But the name Rodney King is going to resonate for a long time as a watershed in the history of the city and even in this country with race relations and police conduct.
Well, if you listen to interviews with Rodney King, he was actually a pretty decent guy. All the rioting and the animosity that followed, which he actually handled very well, is a perfect example of an everyday guy who gets caught up in the whirlwind of history against his will.
My old construction job called me back and told me, can you make it to work Monday? And I'm like, oh yeah, I can make it to work that Monday. And me and my buddies, I went over to the house, we had some beers, and had a nice time. And I decided, let me go up to Handsome Dam where my dad used to take us fishing and kick back. And I got on the freeway, and I was speeding. And I know it's not right to be drinking and driving. But I did it that night, and it was a bad mistake. And that particular night, the police got behind me. I knew once I stopped that car, I wasn't going to have my job on Monday. That new bridge construction job wasn't going to be there. I don't know how I'm going to feed my family now. I like my skin. I like the body that I'm in. I like the path that Jehovah God has chosen for me, whatever it is. I'd say this much. History, I'm a part of it now. And it's a sad way to be in it, but things happen for a reason. If I hadn't been through what I've been through, I wouldn't be sitting here today.
Well, we're going to close tonight with RC Owens, who died recently at the age of 77. And RC Owens also changed things. He was a football player who was a lanky 6'3", and he was also a basketball player. He played in college, by the way, as a teammate of Elgin Baylor. And with his height and his jumping ability from basketball, when he came to football, they introduced a play that was specifically for him, where his quarterback would just throw the ball up near the end zone, and he would outjump the smaller defensive backs and catch the ball in the end zone. It was termed the alley-oop, and this was the introduction of the term the alley-oop, and now it's an everyday play in both football and in basketball. But the alley-oop was first introduced for RC Owens. By the way, it certainly helped that two of the quarterbacks who threw to him most commonly were two of the most accurate quarterbacks in NFL history, who played with him on the San Francisco 49ers, Y.A. Tittle and John Brody. Here's R.C. Owens talking a little bit about his famous play.
Honorary captain for today's game against the Eagles, R.C. Alley-oop Owens. And R.C., you're always here for the games. I've been with the organization, gosh, at least 50 years. Yeah. Probably more than that. But I will start with, what is your favorite memory as a player?
Okay, well, as a player, developing the alley-oop pass and having it thrown by Y.A. Tittle and John Brody, that's probably is the most exciting part of my football life, because those guys can throw it, and I was glad they called my number, and and it's a lifelong part of my football background. And as far as today's game, it's a different game today.
Well, I saw, going back to your comment about Y.A., I actually saw Y.A. here. He's here to support you today as the honorary captain, and how do you feel about this?
Well, he's probably here because he wants to throw the alley-oop pass one more time.
As I said, the alley-oop is one of those plays you see every day today on NFL highlights or NBA highlights, and you don't think twice about it. But it was R.C. Owens who first introduced it to sports. Well, I'm going to close on that note. I want to thank my producer, Sid Tepps. And as a final tribute to R.C. Owens, I'm going to play a record that embodies basically what he did. It was one of the hot records of 1960. For those of you in Chicago, it was the first rock and roll record ever played on the Big 89 WLS, the blowtorch that started rock and roll in Chicago. And it was by the Hollywood Argyles. The Hollywood Argyles were actually one guy, Gary Paxton, who's one of these famous or infamous LA studio cats, who's a great story in and of himself, but we'll probably get to that some other time. It was actually about a comic strip character who was a caveman, who was a bad go-getter and a mean motor scooter, and this cat's name was Alley-oop. And that's how we're going to remember R.C. Owens.
There's a man in the funny papers we all know. He lives way back a long time ago. The cats don't bug him 'cause they know better. 'Cause he's a mean motor scooter and a bad go-getter. Well, this cat's name is Alley-oop.